Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So we came up with a model here at Personality Hacker you've heard us probably talk a lot about if you're a podcast listener, a longtime listener. We call it the CAR model. And it's basically a way for you to understand your cognitive function stack in a metaphor of a four-passenger car. So we have a driver, a co-pilot, and then we have two positions in the backseat, a 10-year-old and a 3-year-old position. And we take your personality, your four-letter code. We find the cognitive function stack from your four-letter code. So for me, as an ENFP, I'd find my cognitive function stack, and then I lay that into this CAR model metaphor to help to understand the parts of my mind, how I learn information and make decisions, and how they're showing up in their capacity and their maturity. And we were recently doing a workshop with our Profiler training students. By the way, if you are new to the podcast, you're like, wait, cognitive function stacks, CAR model, what are you talking about, Joel? We've got podcasts recorded on all of this. Head over to personalityhacker.com. You can do a quick search on our website and find podcasts and articles and even diagrams to describe what I'm talking about to get yourself caught up if you're a new listener. But we were having this Profiler training experience this past weekend with our Profiler training students who are learning the skill of doing live profiling with people, sitting down, having a conversation with someone, and determining their personality type through a conversation. They start with some questions, but we ultimately move them to conversational profiling, where they help someone determine their best fit personality type. And we were going to have a big live event, but obviously world events are keeping everybody home these days. So we decided to switch to a virtual simulated event. It wasn't as robust as the normal live event, but we did it online. It was a great experience, by the way. And we covered the basics of, how this system works, how to do profiling, the 4 elements of a profiling session. We dug into some of the cognitive functions and how they show up for each of the personality types in different positions. We did a lot of work together. And on the final day, we invited several guest speakers, Beatrice Chestnut, Aranio Pius, to talk about Enneagram. And we invited Dr. Dario Nardi, the author of Neuroscience of Personality, to come and present on the final day as well. And he made a comment about the backseat of that CAR model. The lower cognitive functions, the tertiary or inferior cognitive functions, that's what they're technically called. Again, we call the tertiary in our CAR model a 10-year-old position, and we call the inferior a 3-year-old position in the CAR model. And he mentioned that sometimes people, especially later in life, as they mature and grow, can have some of those functions that are in the backseat of their car, in their personality, show up with more maturity than people that have it as their driver or co-pilot, their dominant or auxiliary cognitive function. And Antonia and I kind of took a step back this week and we're talking a little bit about this because we realized that in the CAR model, we present the idea of the backseat of your cognitive function stack, that 10-year-old and 3-year-old, as a maturity framework. So it's like a lot of people see a 10-year-old and a description of 10-year-old, and they immediately ascribe maturity to that. Like, you're basically 10 years old, so you have the maturity of a 10-year-old. And we kind of have used that language to talk about the cognitive functions in the car. So, for example, if I'm losing you here, let me reframe. As an ENFP, my 10-year-old or tertiary cognitive function is extroverted thinking. And we've often talked about, for ENFPs, extroverted thinking being about the age or development of a 10-year-old child. And 10-year-olds sometimes are very insightful, sometimes they have competency and capacity, but sometimes they're very immature and they lack the skill development or the talent to do things well too. So it's kind of hit or miss, right? And this is the metaphor we've used. And in talking this week, we realized, oh wow, we've talked about this in a maturity framework. But I think when we talk about that 10-year-old or that 3-year-old in the CAR model, we actually mean capacity, not maturity. And there's a little bit of a distinction here. There's a distinction between the capacity of my extroverted thinking, effectiveness process at the 10-year-old tertiary place in my personality versus the maturity of my extroverted thinking, effectiveness at the 10-year-old or tertiary place. And there's a little bit of a difference here because as I grow and mature, I can probably grow both my capacity and my maturity. But certainly I believe that my maturity will grow beyond my capacity for this function. And I want to talk a little bit about this today with you, Antonia. What does this look like? What are these distinctions? And why are we now seeing a little bit of a separation here? Why are we making this distinction between these two things? And what does it mean for you listening in your personality and your personal growth journey?
As Dario was discussing the developmental model that he's been working on, and what was cool is that he was talking about some stuff that is going in a book he's writing. So we'll talk about that when it gets published, because I'm sure it's going to be amazing. And this developmental model he was going over is less about focusing on these two positions, and I'm going to call them the tertiary and inferior for the time, so that we can sort of separate out between 10-year-old and 3-year-old. And we can weave that back in, or that idea, a little bit later. So the tertiary and inferior functions, his opinion, and you and I fully agree, Joel, that it's not about stopping all production and focusing on them in isolation to work on. And that's the work of growth for each type. As an ENTP, it's not like I stop everything and go into my tertiary of extroverted feeling or harmony and I'm doing a bunch of work there. Or my 3-year-old or inferior of introverted sensing or memory. It's more that in order to grow and develop, I'm looking for opportunities to integrate those parts into their polarity opposite. So as an ENTP, I would look for opportunities to integrate my introverted sensing into my extroverted intuition, which is very different than focusing on those to grow them independently. So work that would grow introverted sensing all by itself, maybe if somebody is an ESJ and is doing growth work on their auxiliary function, that's going to look different than the activities that are actually high leverage for me, which is more folding in my introverted sensing into my lifestyle that already is very extroverted intuition heavy. So this is less about hitting every single function independently than it is about understanding the dance between all of them. So there's an interesting idea that if I am successful as I age and as I look for opportunities to weave this part of who I am into my dominant or driver function, it's interesting to think that eventually at some point, I might be seasoned enough in my experience or my use of these two functions together, so that when I'm showing my introverted sensing, it could look more mature than somebody who uses it as a dominant or auxiliary function. And I really sat with that for a while, because I was like, well, how could it ever be better, right? But the insinuation or the word choices are so important in this particular podcast, because I don't think, even though we have presented it in a way that could very easily be seen as a maturity model, I think that we have always talked about it in capacity, because one of our favorite words is unsophisticated. The tertiary and the inferior function are less sophisticated in their use than the dominant and auxiliary. But that's different than maturity. Maturity comes with it a different connotation. Maturity is less about a person's ability to use something and more about what their relationship to that thing is. So capacity is seen more like, what is your skill and talent? And I, as an ENP, I'm never going to have the same talent using introverted sensing that an SJ is. Never. I'm never going to top that. It's native to them. They're using it all the time. They're clocking way, way, way more hours using this function than I am. But my relationship to my introverted sensing could be more seasoned over time if I do that integration work than somebody who uses it as a dominant or auxiliary. And the first thing I thought of is, as I'm getting older, I'm noticing that I have a better relationship to routine than I ever did before. I'm appreciating the power of ritual. And because of that, I'm actually able to be more creative if I keep certain rituals going. Like if I take care of my health, if I focus on, really nutrient-dense foods, I can feel it when I haven't eaten well for a while. My body starts to talk to me and I can hear that, and I can respond by going and giving it the food it needs. I can keep abreast of sort of like the routine or the metronome of my life. If it goes off, I can start seeing that in my mood and in my productivity. And so when I was younger, I had a very push away relationship to that function. I didn't like it at all. All evidence of it, all attempts to implement it in my life, it was it was a mess. But now I'm building this healthy relationship with it. And so now I see its place. I feel like I have a sense of sort of discretion around when it should be used and when it shouldn't. And I could see maybe in an ISJ, if they had an over-reliance on it an inability to understand its limitations, almost like a compulsion to use it, which of course we all have a compulsion to use our dominant function, but an inability to do anything else. Their introverted sensing, even though it's their dominant driver and they're always going to outclass me in talent and in skill, they may not have as mature a relationship with it as somebody like me would, because I've had to learn over time how to balance it. So there's a difference between capacity, which is talent and skill, and maturity, which is discretion and your relationship to the thing.
So I want to say two things here. The first is this explains why sometimes you listening, or maybe people in your life or people you know, don't resonate with the idea of that tertiary, as an example, that 10-year-old process as being 10. You might say to yourself, man, mine feels more like 15 or 18. Like I feel like it's a little better than a 10-year-old. And maybe you're right as far as maturity goes. I think it's really interesting to separate capacity from maturity here, because now we're able to look at that as like the 10-year-old capacity, like the ability it might have, but your relationship might be more accelerated. It might be grown bigger. And I'm sure you can also grow capacity too to some degree through practice and skill and time and maturity. You know, as you grow older, you just by nature get more capacity for things as well. So obviously this is a metaphor. You can't look at it super rigid, but this is probably explaining why maybe you don't resonate as much with it being 10. Maybe your 10-year-old or tertiary feels a little older than 10 years old. Feels like maybe 15. And I would caution, though, that's the second thing I wanted to say. I don't want this podcast to let us all off the hook, right? Because we all already overvalue, especially our 10-year-old or tertiary process. Like everybody on the planet, including myself and Antonia, think we're better at it than we actually are. Like our relationship with this, all of us, you listening, me, we all want to say, well, it's more like 15 to 18. Like that's already what we naturally want to say because it's in the same attitude as our driver and our dominant function. So we go here a lot, right? And that's where that looping comes from. We talked about in the Personality Hacker book, and we talk about in the starter kits and all the different programs. This idea of this is in the same attitude, and it's very easy to go here and lean on this process and not go to our Copilot, which is our growth process in our personality. So I just want to make that disclaimer that I don't want this podcast to be something that lets us all off the hook, because we really need to see the backseat of our car as something that needs to be handled properly in service to the front seat of our car. We don't want to over-identify with that tertiary 10-year-old, especially think we're better at it than we are, and then skip the growth we need at the Copilot level or auxiliary function, right? That's still really important for us. So as we talk about that, keep that in mind. Keep that in your mind that we're all going to overvalue our 10-year-old or tertiary process. And we need to find strategies to still look at this idea of capacity versus maturity without clouding our judgment and allowing us off the hook from the growth we need to do.
Well, and I think it's important to remember that in the developmental model that Dario was talking about, he was saying specifically when it gets integrated into the other functions that are its polarity opposite. So we've done other podcasts on the concept of polarities. Sometimes people call them axes or axes. I don't know what the plural of that is, which is why we use the word polarity, because it's much easier for me to remember. But there's the polarized nature between the two sides of the same coin of each of these functions. And so if you're unfamiliar with those, I highly recommend going and hearing or listening to some of the podcasts where we talk about polarities. But it's important to remember that the developmental elements of this is, again, not focusing on it in isolation. It's integrating it into the functions that you have natural talent and strength with. And so it's not a matter of, say, me focusing on extroverted feeling or harmony and doing a bunch of that work. It's me figuring out how to elegantly integrate it into my introverted thinking or accuracy, Copilot or auxiliary function. Like, it's a matter of figuring out the balance between those two things and realizing that the young, quote unquote, younger part of me supports the older part of me. And in that way, I can have a mature relationship with it. It's not that the function itself becomes extremely mature. Like, my extroverted feeling is always going to have a lot of question marks around it. I'm always going to have these moments of faux pas. Like, what is the culture of the room? And am I taking up too much of the oxygen? Like, have I done too much talking again? how will I be able to know? Like, some contexts, people love me talking and going on endlessly. In other contexts, I say 2 sentences together and I'm like, this is not my scene. And all of a sudden I realize I've done too much talking. And there's always going to be a bunch of question marks around it. Unlike somebody who has extroverted feeling or harmony as a dominant and auxiliary or driver or Copilot, FJs are not going to have this problem as much. They're going to be able to read the room much better. But unlike somebody who maybe an IFJ, who knows what they're reading the room well, but is unsure of when to step in and when not to step in, is unsure that they have the capacity, they have the talent, and maybe even some of the skill developed, but there might be, a lack of confidence they have in that function. They may not give themselves permission to fully express something that they have desire for. It's like being able to play the piano and not knowing whether or not you're allowed to go sit down at the piano and play it, right? As opposed to somebody like me who might be able to, bang out some chopsticks, but knows when to go bang out chopsticks versus when not to, right? So it's the sense of discretion. It's the sense of, I'm always going to have a lack of skill in that department. When I say questions around it, meaning that I'm not going to be able to read a room very well. I may have questions around when I'm truly connected to another person. I might not always say things in the most tactful way. I might not really care that much about society's opinion of me when maybe I should care more or maybe I should care less. I'm always going to have just sort of a feeling my way through a fog when it comes to this function. But if I'm doing activities that weave extroverted function into my introverted thinking, meaning that I'm not focused on the social component. I'm not focused on what society thinks of me. I'm not focused on any of that stuff. I'm focused on introverted thinking, which is my strength. And so it's more about what is the truth of the situation? What is going on inside my mind, and how are other people thinking? And what are the truths that aren't being said? What are the models and frameworks that need to be implemented? And then if I bring my extroverted feeling into it, which is more like when I have a tough truth that needs to be articulated, what's maybe a charismatic way of saying it or a funny way of saying it that will help open somebody's mind? What's a way that it lets them know that I care about them, so I'm delivering this information not because of a sense of mental supremacy, but because I actually truly have compassion for the other person. If I'm using it as a way to support that other function, that's how I get a more mature relationship with it. It's not focused on it for growth in and of itself. It's the relationship I build with it that increases the maturity. And then when I show up, maybe I have more of a sense of confidence around me, right? Maybe it kind of doesn't matter if I do faux pas because the work and development I've done to become a more mature person in general, which of course includes this capacity of myself, allows it so that people aren't as triggered, right? They kind of understand it's coming from a good place, and I'm more rested into that part of who I am. And so then I don't have the negative things that come along with this being the tertiary or 10-year-old function normally, because I've moved beyond that and I've built a better relationship with it. So I think, you and I, Joel, are using ourselves as examples, but I think it's a way of sort of understanding that there's a dance in all of this. It's easy to make it static. It's easy to make it adult in the front, in the driver's seat, adult in the navigator seat, 10-year-old in this seat, 3-year-old in this seat. But it's better to look at it like a family unit, a complexity of relationships, more of an interaction between all of these parts, and nothing stays static forever. So it's understanding the opportunities for development and growth and realizing I may never be that great at my inferior function, but I may become mature in my use of that inferior function.
I think the other thing that maturity gives us, you talked about this idea of discretion, knowing a little bit when you can't use it. Maybe you have a maturing sense of discretion, but I think you can also develop a maturing sense of modesty. In other words, I would guess that somebody that has a function at the 10-year-old or tertiary place or the 3-year-old or inferior place may actually have more modesty about their capacity, like their relationship with that, than maybe somebody that has it as their dominant or auxiliary driver Copilot. Take myself, for example. I have extroverted intuition, exploration, we've nicknamed it, as my driver dominant function. And I kind of think I'm invincible around that function. Like when I'm in the world and I don't have a plan, I'd show up to maybe an event, a live event, I over-rely. I just assume I can get on stage and I'll have a download from the universe, or my mind will just start making connections and I can speak extemporaneously, endlessly, and just pull concepts down and be able to talk. I don't have a lot of modesty with it because it's so much a part of my experience as I go through my day. But maybe an ESTJ who would have this as their 10-year-old process, extroverted intuition, exploration, they might have a little more modesty around this. They know their limitations. They know when they hit up against a wall of, I don't think this is going to be the right tool for the job. They have a sense of themselves in that more than maybe I do, because it's everything to my experience. It's how I move through the world primarily. And I bet this probably, if you reversed it, an ESTJ, using extroverted thinking or effectiveness as their driver, probably has a feeling of can handle any task or project without really thinking through the limitations of that, just because it's so much a part of what they can show up and do in the world. Maybe I, using it as my 10-year-old tertiary, have a little bit more of a modesty around what my capacities are. And certainly capacity itself, an ESTJ can outclass me with its raw capacity of extroverted thinking, effectiveness. Like they just can probably get more done, just simply. They have that as a capacity, but they may not know when and when they can't get something done. Like the modesty of knowing when and where may be a little more clouded because they lean on this process so much. And I bet this works for every type. So if you take your type, you may have a more modest relationship with your 10-year-old tertiary and inferior 3-year-old. And you probably have a more immodest relationship with the two passengers in the front seat of your car, your dominant auxiliary.
Yeah, you're talking about overconfidence, basically, right? Like we tend to be overconfident, particularly in that dominant function. I would say that general maturity in an individual does help them become more modest in that 10-year-old or tertiary function overall. Because even though you're going to be less overconfident using it than somebody who has it as a dominant, we are usually a little overconfident in it. We usually lack some modesty when it comes to that tertiary function. And probably because we're using it all the time. We use it all the time. Like we really heavily rely upon it. Even if we're into development and growth and recognize how important it is to develop our auxiliary and really focused on it, we're still using that tertiary function all the time. And so it becomes something that's comfortable to us. Like it's just a part of how we see ourselves. And so because it's so comfortable, I think there's a lot of times sort of this come to Jesus moment when you hang out with somebody who's got it as their dominant and they're so massively outclassing you. Like that's a really humbling moment when you hang out with somebody. Like I think I'm great at extroverted feeling until I hang out with EFJs. And then I'm like, oh, okay, now I understand. Now I see what the capacity of the function itself can be. And so that's usually pretty humbling to do that. And at the same time, you aren't going to be overconfident in your tertiary. I would never be overconfident in my tertiary function, ever. But I might be a little immodest in it. But I'm definitely both immodest and overconfident in my driver. And I think that's another benefit to doing the integrative work of taking the opposite of the polarity and weaving it into a daily practice or really kind of making that a focus. Is my overconfidence in my driver or dominant function has lessened the more I've integrated my introverted sensing or memory. Like the more I rely on precedent and the things that have come before, the more I realize how much easier it is to run something when I've already run it before. By the time I get to like the third time I've run an event or the third time that we've done something online, I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure I know what to do here. I've got a pretty good feel. And then I start getting really creative. I get so much more creative with my extroverted intuition. And I get less overconfident in it because I realize that it's a hammer, but not all the world's a nail. There are lots of other things that should be taken into consideration. And other people are more grateful when we weave in some of that, sort of that precedent, and they have something they can rely upon. So I think the reason why this is a little difficult to talk about is because there's a complexity here. The complexity of where do we feel overconfident? Where do we feel insecure? Where is our ego trying to puff our feathers up because of our insecurity? Like I think in our tertiary function or 10-year-old, one of the reasons why we can be immodest in it is because our ego gets triggered there a lot and we feel really insecure about it. But because it's something we use so often and we want to see ourselves as better, then we feel a need to overcompensate for the insecurity. Whereas that's not the challenge in the dominant or driver function. Like, we're not overcompensating for anything. We're just over-relying. So it's like it's interesting to see our complex relationship with all of these and get a handle on it, which is why just seeing that this is a static model is doing it a bit of a disservice.
So we've talked a lot about the dominant driver, 10-year-old tertiary, and inferior 3-year-old. We really haven't mentioned much about the Copilot auxiliary function for personality and the maturity versus capacity of that. I think of this kind of in the same way I think of the town we live in. So Antonia and I live in the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There's a famous battlefield here. If you're from the United States, you probably are aware of it. If you're from outside the country, a very large battle happened here during the Civil War that really changed the tide of the war and ended up creating a different outcome than if this battle had not happened. So it's a significant place in American history. We've been to the battlefield like once, the visitor center in the battlefield once with our kids. We live here. We've been here 3 years, and we never really go there. And every time I think to go to the battlefield, to tour it or to look at more things, like to really study it, I always think, well, I could do that anytime. Like, if you ever lived in a tourist town or a vacation spot or anywhere that there's something significant around you, you probably are always like, well, we can always go next weekend. There's no reason to go this weekend. I mean, it's always here, right? And you tend to not go to the places that you live around that are significant places. You probably have had this experience wherever you are in the world. This is kind of like, I think, our relationship with our auxiliary Copilot sometimes. It's always there. We've used it in our life. It serves us well, but it's always there. And we might want to go do other things, like, because it's right in our backyard. And even if we do access and maybe it doesn't go well for us, sometimes we get gun shy and we don't want to revisit it again because, again, it's always there. If it doesn't go well, we have to live with this forever, right? I know this is kind of a metaphor of location and vacation spots living there, but I think this is kind of how our relationship with that Copilot auxiliary is for us. And so we tend to bypass it and go to the other parts of our personality. We over-rely on our driver, dominant. We have this reliance on our 10-year-old tertiary. We push away the inferior 3-year-old. And then the Copilot's sitting there, and we all always talk about here at Personality Hacker, this is our path for growth. Go here specifically because this is a place you can grow your personality and start down a personal growth path that starts to turbocharge what you're doing in your life.
Yeah, there's a sense of, it's almost like we take it for granted because it's always there. And I think the reason why we have almost a more consistent relationship with the other functions is it's more about what's happening, not pathologically, but it's almost more about what's happening on an ego level with the other functions than it is for the auxiliary. So like with the driver or dominant, you talked about being overconfident with it. And it's more about how it's like this is our identity. Most people's identity is very wrapped up in that dominant or driver function. So if the world gives feedback about how you're not good at that, or it gives some pushback around that, gives you some critical feedback maybe, it's much easier to either dismiss it because you're secure in this and overconfident in it, or take it too personally and then figure out how the other person's bad or whatever because this is, it was so offensive to your identity. So it's harder to receive that feedback directly because there's so much narrative and so much, relationship to the function itself surrounding us. And a very similar dynamic happens with the tertiary or 10-year-old because we have some insecurity in that and yet we use it all the time. When the world gives us negative feedback around it, it's more about how it sort of hits us because we think they might be right. And so then we get really insecure and we get triggered and flare up. And then it's hard to hear the specific thing, the specific feedback or the criticism because it has to go through this layer of narrative and this layer of what it means in our relationship to the function. When it comes to the inferior function, it's hard to hear any feedback through that lens as well because we're spending so much time pushing it away from us. Like we're trying to not see ourselves as that thing, right? And then we're differentiating away from it because we're so over-identified with the dominant or driver function. So it's hard to hear feedback there too. When it comes to the Copilot auxiliary, though, it's like we have a less triggered relationship with that function in general. And so when we hear feedback around it, it's more likely to penetrate. We're more likely to have a direct relationship to the criticism or feedback we get around it, as opposed to having that feedback go through all these layers of whatever's happening for us with our relationship with these other functions. And so when the world gives us positive feedback around it, we go, oh, okay, this is good. Let's develop this. This is a good thing. And if we hear negative feedback, we have a tendency to blame the tool as opposed to the person giving us that feedback. So we blame the tool and go, oh, maybe we shouldn't use this. Maybe this is bad. Maybe the tool is the problem. Whereas with all the other ones, we don't see it as the problem with the tool. We see it as a problem with us, or we see it as a problem with them. When it comes to the Copilot or auxiliary, we're most likely to blame the tool in that context. And so our relationship with the Copilot or auxiliary function is a little bit less easy to predict, because it could go either way, depending upon the environment we were raised in, the context we found ourselves in, whether or not there were people who were cheerleading us to develop it and we got a lot of reward for it, or whether or not things were demonized, like anytime we used it, the world gave us pushback and demonized it. And so our relationship with that auxiliary Copilot is almost a little capricious, depending upon our context. So that's why it can go either direction. You see people who have really developed that very well, know nothing about type, but just are rock stars there, and it's very obvious in, how successful they become. And then you see people who hide from their auxiliary function and have a terrible relationship with it, and almost always the etymology is that it got demonized by their family or the culture that they were raised in. So that's a very special relationship. As less, as more mundane as it appears, it's a very special relationship. It's one where it's almost like we have the most access to feedback through the auxiliary Copilot, because we look at it in a more objective way. We're far less likely to take it personally or demonize the person delivering it. We're more likely to hear that feedback for what it is. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's a path of growth. It's a place where we can go where we feel confident, and at the same time, we don't feel as wrapped up in it personally. Like there's a sense of, I have natural talent here, and I could build skill, and I could get really good at this. And it doesn't necessarily, it's the development and growth that's a reflection of me not having it in and of itself. It's not like the dominant, which is our identity, which just having it is somehow a reflection of me, whether or not I'm developing it. It's our, like our tertiary. It's whether or not we're showing up as well as our ego tells us we are, as opposed to actually how we're showing up with it. Like it's a more complex relationship with the other functions. That auxiliary is just such a great path of growth and a great path of receiving feedback that even though it's not a complete picture, developing the Copilot is not a complete picture. It's our soundbite. You get 5 seconds to hear anything from Personality Hacker, develop your Copilot, right? That's our soundbite. That's the oversimplified message we put out into the world, because we are living in a world of soundbites and oversimplification. So as Personality Hacker, we chose that one. If we're going to say anything, that's the one. But I think the reason why is because it's such a great first domino to knock over. It's such a great first access point to kind of give ourselves space to grow in a place where we're not constantly being triggered, but just sort of looking at it and seeing all these opportunities and having a space to self-discover. I think that's one of the reasons why that Copilot or auxiliary function is in some ways kind of magical.
So as you're listening and following along, you're probably applying the things we're saying to your personality type. I think that's a great place to start always, right? Start with yourself. What is your type? What is your cognitive function stack or your CAR model? And if you're new, again, a new listener, and you're following along and you're a little lost, head over to personalityhacker.com. There's a lot of resource there to help you understand the basic makeup of your personality, so you can take some of the things we're talking about and unpack this for yourself and find ways in which maybe you are more mature in the functions that are in your backseat versus the capacity, this understanding between capacity and maturity, and then find ways to apply this practically to grow.
Yeah, if you want just a really quick model for what relationship you should being in quotes, but what relationship might be the healthiest to have with the 4-function stack or the car model, is your dominant or driver function is going to be a place of natural talent. But don't just rely on natural talent, build skill there. Go do things that push it out of its comfort zone. Go do activities or reflection or whatever your dominant or driver function is. Go do things that stretch it. Don't just use it and have over reliance and overconfidence on it. Actually hone it as a tool that can be multi-purpose, multifaceted and multi-purpose. For the Copilot function, see it as something that is a way to turn that driver function into something more than it could have been before. It will turn your driver into something that is not just a multifaceted tool, but something that can actually have a true complement, right? It's like a true, it's a true partner to it.
It's like adding fertilizer.
Yeah, it's a way to make sure that your dominant function isn't missing a bunch of things it should be knowing. Like that Copilot could be introverted sensing if you're an ESJ. Are you being careful enough? Are you looking at details enough? Are you looking at timelines long enough and being patient? Like there's so much about that function that can help an ESJ become so much more successful and make sure that they're not just slapping things together, but actually like really, creating a very fleshed out career. Just little things like that. So take your Copilot and look for opportunities to enhance and sort of beautify your driver or dominant function. Your tertiary function needs to be a support structure for your Copilot or for your auxiliary. So the tertiary function isn't something that you want to go to over and over and rely on it all the time either. And you don't want it to be a support structure for the dominant or driver. That's the big problem that we get to in loops, is that we use our tertiary function to support the dominant function. That's not what you want it to be supporting. You want it to be supporting the auxiliary function. So turn its attention away from the driver and turn it to the auxiliary, to the Copilot, and find ways to merge the two of those together. What are activities where your tertiary function can really create almost like an ornamentation for that auxiliary function, right? How can it make it just a better support structure for the dominant? Because don't worry, the tertiary will eventually be supporting the dominant, but through the auxiliary function. And that inferior function, as opposed to something to be pushed away or not seen or make you feel icky, look for opportunities to have that integrate into the dominant, into the driver function. What are activities that honor both sides of those polarities? What are things that don't over-rely on it or push it to a place where you get exhausted, but are just ways to almost create like a support structure for that driver dominant function? What's a way where your inferior function can make just sort of a beautiful, sort of we call it a comet with a tail. Like a comet isn't a comet without a tail. How can you make sure you've got that thing that completes it? Ways to do this, of course, are like if you're an INJ and extroverted sensing is your inferior function, getting into your body, doing things like yoga. And on the flip, if you lead with extroverted sensing as an ESP and have introverted intuition as your inferior, how can you get into meditation and maybe think in terms of long-term implications for your immediate actions? So just finding ways to fold those functions in. And in that way, it's best to not see this, even though it's a car model and a quadrant and a 4-function stack. It's best not to see it just as like 4 quadrants written on a page, but actually rather something that is in motion. Think of it as something that is constantly in movement, constantly fluid, back and forth, and looking for opportunities to make it so that your dominant function wants to steal the show. And if you do it right, you can get all the other functions to not let it steal the show, but to support it as it's doing what it does best, as it's performing at its peak. All these other functions, if done right, can make it so that driver function doesn't have to be overconfident. It can just be confident. It just knows what it can do and rests into itself. And you can tell when people have done this well because they have a general sense of security. They rest into themselves. They know they can handle anything. And in part, it's because of this beautiful dance between their functions.
So what do you think? It's time to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, feel free to ask a question to maybe clarify something we mentioned here in this podcast. Share a comment, something that's coming up for you, or even share your story or experience in your life as you're reflecting on what we're talking about and you're applying it to your personality. You might see some examples from your life that might help us and other people in the community understand this more. You can do that over at personalityhacker.com directly below this show.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. Our book is out. It's called Personality Hacker. You can find it at all major book retailers. If you leave a rating and review on Amazon or Goodreads, that helps us out a lot. And of course, you can leave a rating and review for the podcast on iTunes. That also helps us out a lot. We have a suite of programs that are focused on personal growth through the subject and lens of personality type. So if you want to invest in yourself and take your growth and development to the next level, I highly recommend you go to our website, personalityhacker.com, look at our product suite, and see if there's one that is right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.